Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue our lecture. Now, before we continue with it, I do always like to do a recap of what we had mentioned in our previous lecture. So one of the things that we were talking about is basically how is it that we form and generate ideas, particularly with research. And we also talked about how these ideas can inform and can come from hypotheses or theories. We talked about and discussed what is a hypothesis. Can anybody tell me what a hypothesis is in a very basic sense? Who can tell me? Let's see. Here, right here. What's a hypothesis? Okay. So we know it's testable, we know it's an assumption, and more importantly, we know it's a prediction, right? So if we have factor A, we say, for example, we have two variables, factor A and factor B, we can say something like, when A happens, B will occur, right? Or if A decreases, B would increase, right? So notice that I'm attempting to make a prediction. We also talked about theories, and theories are simply a broad statement that tries to encompass and put together laws, principles, evidence in order to provide an explanation. So notice the hypotheses are there to make a prediction, and a theory is there to provide an explanation. Are there any questions about that? Fantastic. Hashtag fantastic. I'm going to start putting that on the videos for sure. Another thing that we discussed in our previous lecture was, what is it that makes a hypothesis good? Well, one of the first factors was that it has to be testable, right? We have to be able to test a hypothesis. If I am unable to test a hypothesis, that's simply not good whatsoever. We also want to make sure that we can falsify the claim, right? So if I cannot reject that claim, then it turns out that if I don't have the possibility of being able to reject that claim, that hypothesis is not good. We also talked about how a hypothesis, or hypotheses, I should say, we have to be able to replicate that hypothesis. So, for example, what's your name, ma'am?
Hi, Anna.
Anna. So let's suppose that myself, Dr. Shar, conducts and develops this hypothesis, and then I complete my study. Dr. Anna over here would say, well, I should be able to conduct the study just as Dr. Shar did, and I should be able to come up with the same or similar results. If that doesn't happen, there's more than likely a fault on my hypothesis, maybe my statistical methods. So that's one reason why it has to be replicable and precise. And the last thing that we talked about hypotheses is that it has to be parsimonious, right? What do I mean? We have to keep it simple. Right? We tend to hear that science is already complicated, so we don't need to make it more complicated. Generally, because the easier the explanation, the more reasonable it would be. And likely, we wouldn't have to provide evidence that we couldn't simply find with a larger explanation. And I believe that the example that I gave was that you hear a noise in your closet, right? You're home alone, you hear a noise in your closet, and you're thinking, well, it must be someone that broke in. Right? I mean, that could be a hypothesis for sure, but what evidence do we have, right? A more reasonable explanation would be my cat. It's my cat in the room that's making that noise, because that is an easier explanation than try to explain, for example, how did the burglar get past your dog, get past the security system? How come you didn't hear, say, a window broken or being broken into? So notice that the easier explanation would be my cat that's already in the house, and we all know the behavior of cats. That doesn't mean that someone didn't break into your home, but notice that that explanation is more complicated, and you would have to provide more pieces of evidence. Any questions about what makes a hypothesis good? All right, fantastic. And today we are going to continue with how is it that we're going to develop a good idea. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is how exactly do we conduct deductive and inductive reasoning? So when we think about a deductive form of reasoning, we are talking about a top-down reasoning. And what does that mean? I'm going to come from a place of a hypothesis or theory, right? So it comes from a larger scope. And I'm going to bring that down. I'm going to deduce more information from that larger idea in order to make a prediction or an observation, right? So for example, I have a hypothesis that would say the less sleep you get, the worse your exam scores would be, right? That's a hypothesis. Notice that deduction, me thinking, okay, that means that the exam scores are going to be poor. That came from a larger theory or hypothesis, and then we drew down that deduction. Conversely, on the other hand, we have inductive reasoning. What do I mean by inductive reasoning? So now we're not going to move from that top down. We're actually going to move the other direction. So we're going to go from bottom up. And what do I mean? This is based on an observation. Now I'm going to go the opposite way to find and have reasoning. Generally, it's because an observation. So in the same example that I gave you, I observed that students are performing poorly, right? Let's say students are performing poorly in their exams. That's an observation. That's a measurement. I can see, say, for example, everybody has an F in their class. That's an observation that I'm making. So I'm going to go from that observation and I'm going to produce new information to come up with the larger piece of information, right? So in deductive, we go from large to smaller, right? Because we're drawing that type of information, that reasoning, from a larger set. And then from inductive reasoning, I'm moving from bottom up, which means that I made an observation and I'm moving up. So for example, I observed that my students are performing poorly. Wonder why that is. So now we'll have to develop a hypothesis. Now I would actually have to test this idea. So any questions about deductive or inductive reasoning? You guys do this absolutely every day. It's just we actually don't really think about it as much, but we actually do perform that type of analysis and reasoning every day, right? You judge how your professors look like that day. Well, she looks angry, so therefore it must be this hypothesis. So you're trying to inform that larger piece of information. Any questions about that? Something interesting about deductive reasoning is that you are trying to support a claim, right? So for example, if A happens, B occurs. So if the less sleep somebody gets, the worse they're going to perform in an exam. So notice that I'm trying to support that claim, right? I am trying to support the claim that because you didn't sleep, you perform poorly in your exam, right? So I'm trying to support a claim. All right. Now, something immensely important when it comes to generating new ideas is that we should consider at least these three aspects. We would have to conduct a literature review. What's literature, right? What is that? Literature is simply the body of knowledge of published scientific work. Anything that was scientifically published. So you'll hear it until the end of your days if you stay in psychology. Oh, the literature suggests, the literature says. So what we refer is all the scientific published information that has generally been peer reviewed. Generally, most articles and most of the literature is going to be presented in a peer reviewed journal or in an academic book. More often than not, it's usually a peer reviewed journal. In order for me to gain access to this literature, I myself need to conduct a literature review, which all of us are going to start doing in our labs, in this lab, and probably continue until the next. Now, something to remember is that other sources that are not from a peer-reviewed journal are generally not subjected, I should say, to the peer review. And because of that reason, that's why most of your instructors would say, I don't want anything from Wikipedia. I don't want anything from so-and-so source, because generally that hasn't been subjected to peer review. And if you remember correctly, the peer review process is the process where you try to submit your research, and a group of your peers from that publishing company or journal, I should say, will try their hardest to discredit your work. It is scrutinized, it is looked into, sometimes it is replicated. So if there is a fault in your research, it would then be identified before it hits the press. How do we do a literature review? Well, we have 3 steps. The first step here is getting started. When we're getting started, the first thing that we need to understand is that when you're doing your review, you're searching within the general area, right? We're searching within the general body of knowledge, right? So for example, who can tell me what their favorite topic is about mental health? Yes, ma'am.
Anxiety.
Anxiety. So when what's her name?
Kate Bacon.
Kate.
K-T.
K-A-G?
K-A-T.
Oh, K-A-T, so Pat.
K-A-T.
Miss Kate.
Kate. Like
That.
Kate with a K.
So doctor over here, right? Our future doctor over here. Let's suppose that her favorite topic, as she mentioned, is anxiety. When she does a literature review, I am sure if you type the word anxiety, millions of results are going to come up within the data. So notice that you're going to have a general body of knowledge. But the goal is not to look at those million pieces of journals. The goal is to develop new ideas, to find out new ideas that we can later convert into something interesting and a novel and interesting hypothesis. Okay. You always want to either expand upon research, and that will be a new idea, or you always want to come up with brand new research, although that can sometimes be a little bit more difficult. Any questions about that? So every time you conduct a literature review, when you're getting started, you need to come in with a mindset that you are going to look at the general knowledge in order to develop a new idea, which in turn you will convert into a hypothesis. I would suggest that whenever you do that, as I mentioned with her, you always want to look for something that interests you. And why is that? Well, you don't want to spend the whole semester, the whole year, the rest of your life researching something that does not interest you, because research is already a painful process. So how about we make it a little bit less painful by studying something you like? There is a caveat to that, though, that your book doesn't mention. And it's that, sure, you should look into something that you like, but you have to be careful about it. Because say, for example, one of my favorite topics is antisocial behavior, psychopathy, forensic study, right? I am passionate about this topic, I like it. But the problem is when we show a lot of interest, we can become biased. So you have to be really mindful. Your book doesn't mention that, but it's a little note that I would like to bring up. Yes, it's your topic of interest, but keep in mind that because you like it, number one, doesn't mean anybody else in the world cares, right? And we think when we do our research, man, this is the best research ever. It's not. You like it, right? So you need to be objective and say, is this contributing to the greater good of the field? I can have a great interest in basket weaving, but maybe that's not going to contribute to research in psychology. Right, so that's something to keep in mind. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Good deal. The second step in order to perform a literature review is getting organized. And that sounds pretty self-explanatory. The thing about that, though, it's like I mentioned, if I were to go to psychology or Psycinfo, I should say, I'm going to come across so many articles that it is imperative that you have some sort of system, a spreadsheet, a list of DOIs, a list of links, something that would allow you to keep your topics and your links organized. It's important because you can lose track of how, for example, if this is a primary source or a secondary source. What do we mean by a source? A source is any published work, book, printed material, online, from which you are drawing your information from. Now, you can find sources that could be from a secondary source. What is a secondary source? A secondary source is basically any publication that refers to another population, right? What do I mean by that? Say, for instance, you are reading an article and the article, what's your last name, ma'am? Wilson. So you find an article by Dr. Wilson, right? And Dr. Wilson in her article says, according to, what's your last name, sir?
Smith.
So Dr. Wilson would say, according to Dr. Smith, XYZ, that Dr. Smith, that is a secondary source. She is saying about what he said, right? A primary source, on the other hand, is what I like to refer to. It came from the horse's mouth. It came from that source. So Dr. Wilson said that. And I go to that article from Dr. Smith, and we will find that he said that. Right? It's coming straight from the horse's mouth. You're not finding that out within a publication. You read the publication, not that you find it within another publication. Any questions about primary or secondary publications? Yes, ma'am.
This might be simple, but if you have, say, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Smith's sources for your article, are those both then primary sources, even if she's referencing and then in a different section of your article?
So what you would do is you need to remember, where did you get that information? Did you went straight to Dr. Smith's article and you actually found it and you read it? Or are you reporting this based on what she said, of what Dr. Wilson said? So it depends where you draw it from. If you drew it from his article, then yes, that's primary. If you drew it from what she said about him, that would be secondary. Does that make sense? Good. Now, the best way to do this type of search and finding these articles is try to search only from peer-reviewed sources. Because like I mentioned, it took a lot of scrutiny for this paper to be published because it was peer-reviewed. And whenever we do our lab, you'll see that there is an option right there for you to select. I want to do a peer-reviewed search. I don't want to look at anything else other than peer-reviewed sources. I do say it is pretty strict, the procedure for them to be published. It's not perfect. And that's where you come in, because you are the researcher now. So part of the new Nobel ideas is to find out where the deficiencies were, or finding out, they're going to talk about this. I wonder if there's some extension that I can build upon. All right. Any questions so far? And I highly encourage you to ask questions while we're in class, right? Because we don't want anyone to miss out in the question you may have. I do welcome you to talk to me after class, but I always encourage you to ask those specific questions here, because not only does it help your peers here in the lecture, it also helps people that are watching it online. So it does assist other people. So your contributions are always welcome. Now, let's talk about review articles. What are review articles? They basically provide a summary of literature, right? basically your cliff notes, right? Someone actually sat down and read through dozens, if not hundreds of articles in that topic so that you can have a summary of what the data says today, right? Who can tell me about what's their favorite topic about mental health or psychology? She mentioned anxiety. Anybody else?
ADHD.
ADHD, fantastic.
I like number 2.
So imagine how many articles there are published about ADHD. Somebody took the time to read recent data, put it all together, and give it to you in a silver platter. That's what a review article is. But notice, generally that will be done by someone who is an expert in the field, right? If the person is an expert in anxiety, we wouldn't expect them to do a review article on ADHD, right? So generally it is conducted by someone who's already an expert in the field. You have to be cautious though, because remember, let's see. What's your last name, ma'am? Hammond. Okay. So say Dr. Hammond, right? She is doing a review article and it's published, Dr. Hammond, 2021. That will be secondary, isn't it? Because she's telling you about other people, right? So you do need to be careful. It's a great source to find out what's out there and what's not out there, which is the more important point. So you can build upon what's not out there. But notice that it's going to be secondary because Dr. Hammond said that about hundreds of articles. It is important that if you do come across secondary articles, you need to make sure that if you truly want to explore more information, don't rely about what that person said. You want to go to that original source. So in the example that I gave you, Dr. Wilson said, in accordance with Smith's 2020 article, you want to go to Smith's 2020 article. You can find it through the resources and the reference that Dr. Wilson provided, right? Which you should provide your sources because someone will make the effort to go and look into, I like what she said about Dr. Smith. Let me go into it, see if I can find it. Right? So you do want to go to the original source if you're going to cite it. Any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. Now, when we are talking about our third aspect, we're going to start searching. So notice about the preparation that goes into research, which is, this is your preparation today, right? Because we will be conducting literature searches. So let's talk about that third step that you will be engaging in. And that is, you're going to use online databases. Why? Back in my day, there were no online databases. Anybody can relate? Anybody? Hey, sister, I see you. So back in my day, I mean, there was internet, but I mean, it was immensely difficult to get anything. And people were transitioning between hard copies and online versions. So it was difficult, but you guys don't have that problem. So now we're going to talk about online databases. We have multiple means to get and come across different sources of journals. And maybe during our next class, I'll actually show you one published journal. So you'll see what they all look like. They're still published though. People still do it, but the first thing that we need to talk about is a full text article. It's any article that it is available in full. So the complete published version. Why does that matter? Because if you only read an abstract, for example, if you only read the intro of that article, you could be missing out on other information. And secondly, you yourself can mislead yourself into the article, what the article was trying to portray. So it's generally immensely beneficial that you actually sit down and read it. Now, there are databases available for you so that you can limit your results to only full text. And they're generally available through your university. Generally, universities pay thousands of dollars so that their students can gain access for free to the full text. And that is an option that you will have here either as faculty or a student. So if you are affiliated with an university in any way, chances are you do have access to at least a few of the most well-known databases. Any questions about that? Now, this is a short list, and I'm going to put it up in the screen. You don't have to memorize them, of course, but I do want you to take a look at them, right? Because these are very common places where people in the social sciences look for information. So generally, Psycinfo, it belongs to the American Psychological Association, so you can find really good information here. Psycinfo is your friend, and more than that, it's probably your bestie, okay? So I need you to pay close attention. So whenever you're performing your research review, you want to tap into Psycinfo. There's more sources. We have Psych articles, and it has about 66 journals. We have PubMed, which comes from the National Library of Medicine. ERIC, it's an educational source. And we also have JSTOR, which includes other related fields. So you can think about counseling, think about social work. So these are your go-to every time. Don't only limit yourself to one database, okay? That is not, it's not advised, because maybe the article or the information you are looking for would be in another place. So you do not want to limit yourself to just one place. This would definitely be a good place to start, but maybe your topic has to do with anxiety and ADHD in college. So maybe it's a good idea to look into ERIC, because ERIC is related to education. So notice that you don't want to limit yourself to just one place, especially if your topic is pretty weird, right? If your topic is pretty unknown. If I want to talk about unknown factors, so let's say people with COVID and their job performance. So that would be really new. So you're probably not going to find, if we did a search right now about COVID and work performance, we're not going to find that many, right? So you would like to expand and select and tap into other databases. Any questions about that? All right. So these are the steps that you can conduct, and I'm going to leave this up in the screen. You don't have to memorize them, of course, but this will eventually become muscle memory, believe it or not. You're going to conduct so many searches that you will become very familiar with this procedure. I'm going to leave it up here just for a few seconds so that you can read them, or that you can see and pause in the video, because we will be conducting these in person. And for those of you who are watching on your computer, these are the steps that you would need to do in order to gain access to those articles. Now, something that I would like to mention is that if you do come across that full version, you always want to download it, always want to take a look at it. If not, you can read the abstract, and we will cover that as well. But you always want to make sure that you have access to that full text. If it is not available, notice that it is more than likely that you can talk to the library if you are affiliated with any university. And generally, the librarian will be able to do a loan, right? So they can actually look that up for you, and they can ask that publisher, hey, I want access to this article. Can you please grant us access? It does happen every now and then. It is kind of weird. But if you do come across this article and you're thinking, wow, this is a really good source, you don't have to miss out. Generally, the university does have funding in order to gain access to resources that perhaps we don't have access to. So I don't want you to think that you're going to be missing out. And something really interesting, if you speak more than one language, maybe exploit that, because maybe what you're looking for is not in the language that you're searching in. So in my case, I can read in 3 languages. So I do that, and I had to do that because the study that I did for my dissertation was a little bit weird. And there wasn't a lot of information about it, so I actually had to start tapping into other sources. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, but a statement. I'm a huge fan of Mendeley. You can access just about anything. Like I got the DSM-5 for free on there.
Okay.
So, and it can link to your Word and import sources already done for you and everything. And you can connect it to the UH library and request everything gets downloaded in the same place. It's really cool.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. I haven't heard about that before, and I recommend that if you do have access, I think I do have it in our course that students can post to. So like if you find something cool like that, like, hey guys, I found this. How about you guys exploit it? Yes, ma'am. So I do welcome you to post that in our discussion.
Two for them. One, do you prefer that we not use the same library? Or do you prefer for us to use those search areas instead of the libraries?
Right. So something really important is that you do want to use the online versions first. First of all, it's more accessible. Second of all, you can filter it based on peer review, based on full text. So you can gain access to more data online.
I meant more so they have an online version that's very similar to those where you can like filter and search for research.
Right.
So do you prefer for us not to use that one and use these instead?
I would say use it, especially if your topic is a little bit rare. Study effects of COVID and concentration with ADHD patients, right? That's oddly specific, so you do want to branch out. As long as your source is credible and it's peer reviewed, I mean, if we can get it from a Cracker Jack box, I mean, that's where you found it, as long as it's peer reviewed.
Also, I know this was something that was told to me a couple classes ago. Sometimes if you have an article that you can't find access to, you can email the person who released it. And so a lot of the time they'll just email you a copy of it. So that could be useful.
You actually can, and I'm going to give you a very short demonstration because, of course, we wouldn't want to, I want to distract you guys, but you can actually contact the individual themselves, right? So if you had to, generally, if you explain that you are a student and that it is for educational purposes only, that you're not going to, hey guys, check this out and post it on TikTok or something like that in a public place. You do want to ensure that you let them know that you are a student, that you're not a practitioner. It would be a little bit harder for somebody like me who's not a student to get a hold of that. But you do want to say, I am a student, it's for this course, and I want it for this reason, and ask very, very nicely with your please and thank yous. And more than likely, that person will send it to you. A lot of people, ResearchGate, I like to think about it, it's not social media, but it is where a lot of individuals will, let me go back, a lot of individuals will let you know what the field is, and if you want to contact them for an article. So for example, person will let you, okay, this is my profile, this is my specialty, and if you want to contact them, you can actually, let me share this screen first. So you can see the person, their area of specialty, and if you wanted to contact them, you can do so and contact them directly. For sure, you could. This would be a really good place to do that on the ResearchGate. Be really beneficial. Any more questions, comments, concerns? Fantastic. All right. Okay. Now, you can come across ethical issues when you are conducting your literature review. And you're thinking, I'm not even talking to real people, so how is it that I can have ethical concerns? Well, one of the things that we need to consider is always to double check your source, right? You always want to make sure that you're double checking your source, because I don't want you to think because Dr. Wilson said this, Dr. Smith said that, Dr. Shar said that. I don't want you to think that is necessarily accurate, right? So you always want to come in with a level of skepticism. So when you are citing a secondary source, which I would just encourage you to avoid it entirely, just don't cite a secondary source if you can indeed get a hold of it strictly and directly from the source. But if you must cite from a secondary source, you have to make sure that you cite that correctly. In APA, the American Psychological Association does have a way for you to cite that correctly. So say it wasn't Dr. Wilson that said it, it was Dr. Smith that said it, and I found it under Dr. Wilson's article, right? You always want to make sure that if you can, find that primary source. And there's a really good thing about citing a primary source. Why is that? Well, because you can go to a primary source, right? You can go to a primary source. And let me show you in regards to a primary source. So say you're looking for a primary source. So I'm going to look for a primary source. I'm going to share the screen so everybody can see it. So say, for example, this is one of the research aspects that I covered. So this would be a primary source. So say you want to read, I am interested in the impacts of religious discrimination and anxiety. All right, so let's take a look at that. So this would be considered a primary source, right? Because you directly conducted that citation through me, right? So you looked into a primary source. But interestingly, you can go to the references and you can find secondary sources. So if you're already interested in religious discrimination, for example, you can say, well, what did this primary source look into? And you can actually find this. It's like, I think I'm interested in this article. Let me look it up. So you can find even more articles because someone literally had to sit down and put this all together. This is served in a little box with a little bow at the top, right? So you can find a primary source. And if you read it, you're like, I really like what say Soto said. All right, let me go down to the references and check out what they said. Okay, so you can find extra sources, secondary sources, and turn them into primary. Any questions about that? I like to call it a little cheat sheet because you have the sources there, right? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any way you can tell just by glancing at them what sources are going to be better than others?
I'm sorry?
Is there any way just by glancing at them you can tell what sources are going to be better than others?
That's a really good question. So she's asking, just by looking at them, is there a way to think, is one better than the other? There's multiple ways you can do that. Of course, don't ever take anything by face value. You always want to make sure. Something you can use is the journal, right? So for example, Soto published on journal XYZ, right? And that journal has a reputation of being very strict, right? And you know that chances are that that article that Soto published came from a good source, that it's actually worthwhile. I don't like to say that maybe a lesser known journal might be worse. It may not be. They might be the best one. It's just they're lesser known. So, or they may be a little bit new. So I don't want you to think, oh, if it comes from this journal, this is the only journal I'm going to look into, because just like with the databases and not selecting multiple, you can also be limiting yourself by just looking at, like, I trust this journal. This is a journal that I'm going to look into because I know that this is a good one. And so I wouldn't want you to think, just because it came from this place that it must be a good article. There might be really excellent articles someplace else. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Any more questions? Outstanding. Outstanding. Now, you always want to make sure that you are comprehensive, that you want to limit your search, however, to a certain time frame. So you could say, I'm going to look at all articles published about anxiety since the history, since people started writing. Well, I mean, you could do that, but generally we like to look into stuff that has been published within the last 5 years. You always want to keep that. Sometimes you can do that, perhaps because your topic is not well known. For example, COVID. We haven't had COVID for 5 years, right? So that could be an impact. But you can also find historical data, right? So if you are looking into humanistic psychology, sure, you want to look into what's going on or what has been going on for the last 5 years, but maybe you want to go to something historical like Rogers, for example. You want to go back, right? So you may want to go a little bit further. Always search for journals archives. You want to make sure that you're searching within multiple databases. And I encourage you to look into a portion of the article just to determine, okay, is this going to be relevant for my paper? Is this going to be relevant for my research? The best way to do that, to just read a little portion of it, is to read the title and the abstract, right? Any questions about that? So let's talk about that a little bit further. A title, it's usually a single sentence that is going to tell you about the topic of the study. Generally, if you have a really good title, it's going to give you what are the variables, what is the population, what was the method, what did we find out. That's generally a really good title. So in the example that you saw earlier, the title was The Impacts of Religious Discrimination Towards Anxiety in Diverse Populations. Impacts is a quasi-experiment. The impacts of religious discrimination was the independent variable. Anxiety was the dependent variable in diverse populations. So I'm telling you that it came from a wide group. So I told you absolutely everything, the variables, the method, and the population. Right? So notice that it was a large topic and that was just one sentence. Okay, so a good title will usually have everything in it. An abstract, it's simply a summary, right? It's simply a summary of that particular article. Generally, an abstract is very small, right? Generally, it's less than 250 questions, and we want to keep it that way because you will be citing dozens, if not hundreds, not necessarily for this class, but if you do start doing research or if you go for your doctorate in psychology, you will have to write a dissertation and you will look into hundreds of pieces of information. You don't want to waste your time looking into which one's the best one. That's why we have abstracts, right? And the abstract is going to give you a brief summary of everything that was done within 250 words. The introduction is simply the overview, right? That's going to be the overview of the research topic, and it's going to tell you how interesting or how applicable and well it is for the hypotheses that we're trying to expand upon and we're trying to build upon our field. The method section of an article is simply that description, right? It's a description of what is it that I did, right? What instruments did I use? What procedures did I utilize? What type of participants? Where did they come from? How did I draw the participants? Basically, it's the step-by-step description of your research. Why is it that I have to give you a step-by-step purpose and how is it that I conducted the study? First of all, to limit deception. And second, because if, say, what's your last name now?
Glenn.
Bland?
Glenn, Glen.
I can't spell. G-A what?
Glen. Glenn.
Glenn.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So imagine that Dr. Glenn does a study and she's not descriptive under her method section. I can think about two things. I can think about there's some deception. Why is it that she had to hide her steps? Or if I try to replicate the study, I need to do it exactly how she did it. So that way I can come up with similar results. The results, I'm just going to give you a summary of what I found. This is the data that we came across, right? This is the data that we found. Notice that it's not an explanation. It's not an explanation. It's simply giving you a description of what is it that we found. The explanation, however, would be the discussion. Now I'm going to tell you what conclusions can we draw from that data. And your references, of course, you guys are familiar with references. It's basically the list of everything and every source that I did cite and included in my study. Any questions about that? Fantastic. And always, if you always want to find more articles, go to that reference section because it's right there in a little box with a big old red bow. Okay, so that's where you can find more resources. Interestingly, once you come across this article, the second step you should engage in is use critical thinking, use your judgment. Think about the participants, what methods did they use, and the conclusions. Why is that? First of all, because you want to make sure it is sound, right? One of the first things. And secondly, that's where your hypothesis can come from. What do I mean? Let's think about the first example, which would be participants. Right? Say we look into a study about Latina females in the engineering program. Right? So we conducted a study and we published it, and you find it and you think it's interesting, but then you look into it, it's like, it only studied Latina female participants. What would happen if I did the same thing, but with Asian students? So notice that now you have a new hypothesis. You literally have a new research question. If nothing else, because you looked at the participants. Maybe the methods and procedures, that's where you're going to find your hypothesis, your new and brand novel idea. So say in the methods, say they did a realistic observation. You're like, I wonder what would happen if I, instead of doing a naturalistic observation like they did, what would happen if I start translating this into statistics? Perhaps let's conduct an experiment now based on this information. So notice how right then and there, you just developed a new research. The other thing you need to consider is to know the sources. Where did this information come from, I should say? Did it come from a primary, secondary source? Is this person known to be reliable? Is this person known to be deceitful? And the last thing that you need to consider is your own issues, right? Your own biases. Why is that important? When you're conducting your research, say you are conducting it in bipolar 1 disorder, mania, depression, that good stuff. And you start looking into this research article, and you're only looking at research articles that already support your hypothesis. That is a huge problem, because a good scientist and a good researcher and a good practitioner will look into articles that discredit his hypothesis. Because it's pretty simple, right? To say, I'm only going to look into articles that substantiate my claim that people with bipolar 1 disorder will have more marital problems. Okay, well, that's your hypothesis. And then you only look at articles that are based on that. So how good was that search, right? You want to look into other pieces of information that do not corroborate your idea. You also, as I mentioned earlier, you want to be aware of your own biases, because I can think that studying bipolar 1 is the greatest thing on the planet, but it might not be, right? It's not needed. What your hypothesis, what you're looking into is not needed, right? Or it's not necessarily in a field that we want to look into. So for all we know, what you're trying to study is not needed. So your own bias can come into play. So any questions about that? Fantastic. Once you start moving towards your graduate field, so your master's or your doctorate, you start noticing that you will receive a lot of training when it comes to minimizing your biases. Because if you think you don't have a bias, you're absolutely incorrect. There is something that you do not understand, or something that was mentioned to you in the past, or something you grew up with, or an experience you might have had, and that has led to a bias, and that is okay. You can have a bias. It's a matter of let's mitigate this bias so it doesn't filter into your research or practice. Interestingly, you can also find in your literature review, you can also find and generate new ideas through many different ways. For example, you can identify a flaw, which would be the easiest way to come up with your research idea. Because, if you do find something that's faulty already, hey, let's fix it. There it is. There's my hypothesis. It's, that's where I found it from. You can find contradictions, right? So that's where that example that I gave you of, if you're really interested in bipolar 1 and bipolar 1 symptoms as they relate to marriage satisfaction, find contradictions, find something that says, yes, they are related, and find something that says, no, they're not related. And that in that conflict, you can find your hypothesis. Consider anomalies, consider issues, and think past that research. What do I mean that you need to think beyond that research? Anybody here a double major? Okay, what's your double major in?
Biology and psychology.
Biology and psychology. Those are two separate fields, right? But interestingly, because you can think outside of the box and say, I'm going to do my literature review on biology and psychology, because within that intercept, there could be a research question, which clearly we know there is. So, right, if you have taken biological psychology, neuropsychology, you will know that there is a clear relationship between biology and psychology, because every single psychological process involves something physical, physiological, structural, hormonal. There's always a physical component to everything mental health. So clearly, she could draw her research because of that combination. So you want to think outside the box. Any questions? Fantastic. Outstanding. How else can we come up with these testable ideas? Well, once we have that idea, I want to make sure that I use confirmation and disconfirmation. Within a confirmational strategy, we're going to find positive results that confirm that hypothesis, that confirms that prediction. So for example, you can say, if A happens, then therefore B is true. So let's keep with our example of bipolar 1. The more active manic symptoms we have in bipolar 1, the less marriage satisfaction. So if there's a lot of symptoms, then B must be true. So A is true, B must be true. The problem with this type of approach, just like with anything in science, there's a benefit and a limit, is that the issue, this relationship or this conclusion that you're drawing may not be true or may be a fallacy, right? Just because A happened doesn't necessarily make it true, right? And you'll find that in correlations. Just because foot size is related to better test performance doesn't necessarily mean that was caused by the other. So that would be a fallacy, or simply not true, simply incorrect. Any questions about confirmation? We tend to use confirmation a lot in our daily lives. You just think about one time when you thought you were right, and then it turns out, wow, you were not. We use that every day. Now, this is perhaps the better way to test our idea. Because here you're going to find an affirmative result, a positive result that is going to discredit your hypothesis. That's what you want to look into. You want to find evidence to the contrary, because you want to limit this bias that I was mentioning earlier. So whenever we are looking to disconfirm our own hypothesis, is that we will be able to, first of all, limit our ability to commit a mistake, because you could be wrong. There's perhaps no relationship between bipolar disorder and marital issues. So it's a good thing that you're actually discrediting yourself before it actually turns into a whole research project that took you a year, 2, 3 years, 10. And the other thing is that you can find evidence to the contrary that's going to help you in substantiating your claim. So if yours still stands, you're actually doing a really thorough job. Any questions? Fantastic. Now, there's something called publication bias. Interestingly, this is where the editors tend to show and tend to pick articles that did come from positive results and reject those that have negative results. So if we are the Journal of Bipolar 1, right? And I consider that this has merits. Well, I'm kind of going to reject articles that discredit that idea, right? So that is a form of bias that you can't find within journal publications. Now, that is because we can find instances where we can observe an effect and the significant outcome of the study, but sometimes we may fail and see that significant effect. And so the person reviewing the article may simply just publish and always publish research that supports their preferred idea, and therefore the rest of us will miss out within the rest of the literature because that's all it's published. Any questions about that? All right, so that is going to be the end of this lecture, and let's continue to our next lecture.